Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Today we're talking to Peter Scott, Technical Director from Origin Fertilisers, and Ben Lowe, National Forage Manager from Agrii. What can farmers do to balance input costs with improving their grassland performance? What can that mean for the livestock enterprise? How can we rethink grassland fertiliser, as fertiliser is animal feed? Well, let's ask the experts. So, good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning, Tony.
Good morning to you. So, Peter, if we could come to you first. So, tell us more about the use of fertiliser on UK grassland. What is happening?
Good question. First and foremost, Tony, I think it's worth setting the scene when we're talking about grass and making a few comments and facts around what we're actually dealing with. Grass is the largest single crop area in the UK. We've got about 6.5 million hectares of managed grass, so that's excluding rough grazing, so that's grazed grass and silage and hay. And it actually accounts in a fertiliser context for about 30% of the total fertiliser market. So in round numbers, that's round about 1 million tonnes of fertiliser. So if we said average spend £500 per tonne, we're talking about grassland farmers in the UK spending, give or take, £500 million per annum on fertiliser. And I've got a strong belief that we need to change the narrative on that, the way we look at that fertiliser. In an arable context, we quite often use the term, when we talk about fertiliser, we talk about it as plant food. And I think what we've got to think in terms of fertiliser on grassland farms is to think of that fertiliser as animal food.
That's a big change in approach, isn't it? So where do we start in terms of rethinking, as you called it, the narrative?
Yep, we've got to understand what we're working with, and that means analysing our inputs. Where are our nutrients coming from? So on a grassland farm, we need to not just analyse the soil that's growing the grass, but we also need to analyse the grass as it's growing, or the grass as it's cut in the case of silage, and take mineral analysis. And we also need to be doing more analysis of manures, slurries, all the sources of nutrient input, and then pulling all that together into a nutrient management plan so that we're actually then calculating and the right amount of each nutrient from fertiliser for that specific field.
And Ben, if I can come to you, how many grassland farms in the UK are carrying out this depth of analysis?
Traditionally, Tony, I would say, to be fair, probably not enough. But what I would say is last year we saw increases in all sorts of input costs on farms, especially on mixed farms, livestock enterprises, whether that be fertiliser or feed in particular. And what that did do is it really drew the attention to those input costs and actually started raising a lot of questions around what is being spent and where. It focused the mind, for want of a better phrase, for quite a few. And many did start doing that in-depth quantification, I guess, of what their forage holds, what their soil holds from a nutrient content, but then also their slurries and manures, as Peter's mentioned. And some of the feedback was really quite stark in actually, once they've quantified what is available to them or not available to them, how their approach would differ for the better in many ways from what they would traditionally do on a more routine basis year by year.
So, Peter, when can farmers start to carry out this analysis in order to understand their grassland better?
That's a really good question, Tony, and the simple answer is any time. The beauty of the grassland system is it's a continuous loop, so that you can start it at any time. So, if you're thinking of starting it now, start with some soil analysis. Make sure that you've got your soil analysis no more than 5 years old for any given field. If you're going to be, applying slurries or manures, look at having them analysed. Take samples of fresh grass. When you cut your silage, take a sample of the silage and have a mineral analysis taken, so that you actually understand what the nutrient content of the grass is.
So, Peter, this analysis, how does it help us do things differently, and what are the benefits?
Yeah, sure. If we think of fertilizer on a grassland farm as part of the feed cycle, rather than thinking of it as a bolt-on purchase, I think that's the starting point. One of the big differences between arable crops and grass is that a livestock farmer is producing grass for his own internal market. Fundamentally, he or she is growing grass to be eaten by the livestock on that farm. And so there's two issues or challenges. One is we need to produce enough grass, so the quantity of grass. And the second aspect is the quality of that grass that we're producing. And I think there's an opportunity if we rethink fertilizer and use our integrated analysis to make sure that we're identifying the correct nutrient inputs and the correct balance. That gives us an opportunity to produce the right quantity of grass, but almost as important, if not more importantly, influence the quality from a feeding perspective. So we can actually use fertilizer to grow the grass, but also to improve the nutritional quality. So what do I mean by that? An example would be, I think one way of rethinking it is to encourage farmers to say, right, I'm going to grow X hectares of silage. What quality of silage am I looking for in terms of digestibility, protein, energy, nutrient content, mineral balances? And then have that discussion with your advisor, because there's things that we can do in determining the right fertilizer that will directly impact on that feed quality. So for example, not only do we want to get the right protein level, we want to get a high level of amino acids, true proteins. So we need to be thinking of how much nitrogen am I putting on, and therefore how much sulfur do I need in relation to that nitrogen to optimize the protein content. There's things that we can do around palatability and digestibility. So getting more sodium into the grass to improve the dry matter intake, the palatability and the intake, but also to get the balances, some of the key mineral balances right. So for example, that balance between potassium and magnesium, potassium and sodium that improve the feed quality, reduce the risk of conditions such as hypomagnesemia, grass staggers. So there's a lot we can do with fertilizer if we take a more analytical approach to actually improving the feed quality of grass.
And that makes perfect sense. It really does. And is this just as relevant between those growing grass for ensiling as well as those growing grass for pure grazing?
Yes, absolutely. I don't really differentiate between the two in that sense. Again, with grazed grass, we need to be looking at fertilizer programs little and often. We need to be thinking of fertilizer in terms of how much grass is actually growing, how much grass do we need, what quality of grass do we need, how are we going to improve that maximize that dry matter intake. Your big challenge with grazed grass is optimizing grass utilization and ensuring that as much of the grass that's growing is actually being eaten by the livestock. So again, simple things we can do that have been well understood for a long time. So for example, applying sodium, we know that it increases the sugar content of grass. So lots of little simple things we can do just by taking that step back and thinking about it before simply picking up the phone and saying, well, I've always had straight nitrogen or 20-10-10, so I'll have the same again.
And Ben, let's think of this from the farmer perspective. What Peter's talking about are really significant benefits if we get this right. Should farmers be listening to this advice and taking this really seriously?
Absolutely, Tony. And of course, the knock-on impact when it is that we are, really looking into the nutrition of both the soil and the forage that you're producing as a grower really massively impacts down the line in terms of the reduction in bought in feed. We'd seen that the cost of inputs around livestock feed and in particular imported feed constituents really increased last year. So getting the most from your forage and getting everything, not only just yield but quality of it, drives massive benefits all the way down the line.
The 2023 Agrii Guide to Grassland Roots is now available. This is a golden edition of the document to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Master Lay's. Follow the link in the podcast bio to download the document. And so, Peter, what is the actual role of fertiliser in improving that grass quality? I know you've touched on that, but tell us a little bit more about that.
Interesting. Going back to what I said at the beginning of the total market on grassland for fertilizer is round about 1 million tons, just over 1 million tons a year. it's actually dominated by one nutrient, which is nitrogen. And yes, we need that nitrogen because it drives our grass production. But we need so much more than nitrogen to produce the right quality of grass. So I mentioned earlier, about sulfur. For every 100 kilograms of nitrogen we're applying, we should be looking at applying 20 to 30 kilograms of sulfur. Sulfur in its own right will drive dry matter growth, but more importantly, what it will do is help the plant take up that nitrogen and convert it into protein. One of the downsides to excess nitrogen, for example, in silage, if a farmer cuts grass to ensoil and it's too high in nitrogen at the point of cutting, we end up with a lot of nitrate in the grass, i.e. not converted into protein. It reduces the feed value, but it'll also reduce the quality of the fermentation. So that's one example, is looking at not nitrogen in isolation, but looking at it alongside sulfur, because the two work hand in glove. The other nutrient that grass requires in significant quantities is potash. Grass requires almost as much potash as it does nitrogen, but the animal doesn't require that quantity of potash. Yes, the animal requires some potash, but it actually requires a lot of calcium, magnesium, and sodium in relation to that potash. So we need to feed potash to grow a crop of grass, but we need to be really careful that we don't end up with an excess of potash in relation to the animal's nutritional requirement. It's well understood, because if we end up with too much potash in relation to other nutrients, you increase the risk of hypomagnesemia, grass staggers. Quite often I get people saying to me, particularly vets and nutritionists, we need to look at reducing the amount of potassium, particularly in silage fertiliser, because we're running a risk of hypomagnesemia. And to me, that's a classic microcosm of the problem. We cannot look at one nutrient in isolation. So my answer to that is, it's not that the potassium in the grass is too high, it's that there's not necessarily enough calcium, magnesium, and sodium in relation to that amount of potassium. We need that potassium to grow the crop. So what we actually then need to do to get the mineral balances right is to make sure that we're also getting calcium, magnesium, and sodium into the grass to balance out that high level of potassium. So it's all about looking at mineral balances, which will help improve the feeding quality of the grass from an animal health perspective. And that's why I say at the beginning, we need to rethink fertilizer and not just think of it as growing grass, but as growing a certain quality of grass from a nutritional point of view. It is fundamentally part of the animal feed system on a livestock farm.
Ben, what are you thinking as you listen to Peter's expert advice there? What are you thinking? Because I know you've got livestock of your own, haven't you?
We're all looking at these things slightly differently. We're all now starting to really value that response from attention to detail, and really tailoring these and seeing the results. We can see that the results are there. They're clear to be seen, and quantifiable for the benefits that they can bring at not only increasing and improving the quality of forage on farms, but of course decreasing additional inputs that are currently being paid for on farms.
And Ben, can you think of some of the farms perhaps that you speak to where this attention to detail could make a real difference to their livestock performance?
Oh, there's many. Even if we take one farm in its own right, never mind several businesses, we know that farms across their area change and vary massively. So that then translates from whether it be a soil type, a soil nutrient, or grass mixtures that are on those fields, that then gives you a variation in terms of the grass that's being harvested, whether that be yield, but even more importantly, as Peter's been discussing really well today, the quality of that grass that comes in. We know that consistency is the key driver for performance within livestock, and we need to ensure that consistency throughout the cuts, throughout the grazing platforms, and the performance that grassland gives.
What I'm hearing from you is that it isn't just about that nitrogen. It is about a balanced approach in terms of nutrition, and that's the key to efficiency. Have we got that right?
It goes back to the point I was making about, of that 1 million tons of grassland fertiliser, it's dominated by nitrogen, and we need that nitrogen to grow our grass. But to get the best utilisation or efficiency of the nitrogen that we're applying, we need balanced nutrition. And in actual fact, that goes back a step. It's the most basic fundamental of nitrogen use efficiency is making sure we've got the pH right. and that's not the case in a lot of livestock farms. We need to make sure that we get the pH right to get the nitrogen uptake as effective as possible. But we also need to have our phosphate, potash, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, sodium, other nutrients need to be in balance, which will determine from our integrated analysis for the plant to be able to take up nitrogen and utilize it efficiently, i.e. convert that nitrogen into protein and amino acids.
So Peter, how do we know that this makes sense, that scientifically this is going to lead to an improvement?
We've got world-renowned research in this country on grassland nutrition from fertilizers. A classic example was work done by University of Bangor in North Wales, where they looked at the impact on livestock performance of with dairy cows, looking at paddocks fertilized with straight nitrogen, and they compared that to paddocks fertilized with nitrogen plus sodium. So the only difference between the treatments was the addition of sodium, and it had huge quantifiable benefits. So it increased grazing time, it increased walking distance, dry matter intake was increased by around 18%. It reduced somatic cell count, so there was direct improvements in animal health, and all of that led to increased milk output of around about 9%, just from the addition of sodium to complement the nitrogen. And fundamentally what that sodium was doing was increasing the sugar content of the grass, making it more palatable, driving dry matter intakes up, and also improving the nutrient balance within the animal. So the sodium was improving the pH, it was buffering the pH within the rumen, reducing incidence of acidosis. So that the addition of one simple nutrient such as sodium alongside that key driver of growth, nitrogen, had quantifiable benefits in terms of animal performance and output.
And Ben, what would you encourage livestock farmers to do differently after listening to this really valid advice?
I think many growers are already thinking differently, as we've discussed, following on from last year and the catalyst behind, looking at where they spend, how they spend, and how they go about quantifying their inputs on farm. And it's just all about keeping that up and maintaining it, regardless of where the market may well be for input costs, especially around fertiliser and nutrition, as Peter's discussed. It's maintaining that and keeping that attention to detail. And also, even from my own point of view, being involved with livestock outside of my role within Agrii, that balancing of nutrition that Peter keeps talking about today. We're often looking at balancing nutrition and diets for livestock, whether that be grazed grass, haylage, silage, maize, whatever it could be throughout forage, to be fair, as an ensiled or a harvested product. But Peter, so well today, I think, has drawn our attention to balancing that nutrition, balancing that diet for the grassland crop, pre-harvest, pre-ensiling, grazing, whatever it may well be for the livestock ration that we're used to spending so much time on, and we need to give that same sort of vision of thought to a nutritional diet effectively for our very, very valuable grassland within the UK.
Thanks, Ben. And at the start of this podcast, Peter, you spoke of rethinking grassland fertiliser. So what would you encourage UK livestock farmers to do and think differently?
Firstly, I'd urge livestock farmers to stop and think before making a purchase decision on fertiliser. I'm Scottish, so money's close to my heart. The most expensive fertiliser is the wrong fertiliser. So let's take time to do the analysis, understand the analysis of our soil, of the grass we're growing, of any manures we're applying, understand that fertiliser can play a role in improving the feeding quality of the forage, and use those analytics, get good advice from somebody to pull it all together and to give you the right fertiliser for your farm.
Thank you, Ben and Peter. Thought-provoking technical advice when it comes to rethinking grassland fertiliser. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you'd like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.